Mary Bell's story is as chilling as it is tragic. A child who became a killer, her actions shook the world and raised haunting questions about innocence, responsibility, and the impact of a deeply troubled upbringing. To understand how an 11-year-old girl could commit such horrific acts, we must first step into the dark and chaotic world she came from. Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26, 1957, in Scotswood, a working-class neighborhood of Newcastle upon Tyne, England. Her mother, Betty, was only 17 when Mary was born. A well-known local prostitute, Betty was absent from home more often than not, leaving Mary in the care of others, sometimes her father, William Bell, a violent alcoholic and petty criminal, and sometimes nobody at all. From the beginning, Mary's life was marked by neglect and rejection. Family members recalled how, moments after her birth, Betty screamed at hospital staff to take that thing away from me. It was a foreshadowing of a childhood defined by cruelty. Betty's behavior as a mother was not just neglectful, but shockingly abusive. Mary suffered countless accidents that raised suspicion among family members. There was the time Betty allegedly dropped Mary from a first-floor window. Another time she gave her sleeping pills as if they were candy. Betty even went so far as to sell Mary through an informal adoption arrangement, only for Mary's older sister to retrieve her and bring her back home. These incidents, however, paled in comparison to the darker abuse Mary endured. By the mid-1960s, it is alleged that Betty began involving her daughter in sadomasochistic sessions with her clients. Mary was forced to endure unimaginable violations, blindfolded, restrained, and exploited by men her mother had brought into their home. This traumatic upbringing left deep scars on Mary. At school, her teachers and classmates noticed her unpredictable behavior. Mary's moods could shift without warning. One moment she was laughing and playful, the next she was consumed by rage. She was prone to violent outbursts and often lashed out at other children. There were reports of her attempting to strangle classmates or block their airways with sand. These were not mere playground fights. They were disturbing precursors to something much more sinister. Despite her troubled behavior, Mary found a companion in Norma Bell, a slightly older girl from a neighboring home. Although they shared a surname, they were not related. Norma, described as submissive and intellectually delayed, seemed to follow Mary's lead. Together, the two became an inseparable but troubling duo, often seen wandering Scotswood and its derelict buildings. By the spring of 1968, Mary's violent tendencies escalated. On May 11th, a 3-year-old boy was found bleeding and dazed near a disused air raid shelter. He told police that Mary and Norma had pushed him from the roof, but he couldn't identify which one was responsible. That same evening, 3 young girls reported that Mary had tried to strangle them while playing in a sand pit. When questioned by police, both Mary and Norma denied any wrongdoing. Norma admitted witnessing Mary try to choke the girls, but insisted she had told her to stop. Despite the alarming nature of these incidents, the girls were simply warned and sent home. Just 2 weeks later, on May 25th, Mary committed her first known murder. Martin Brown, a 4-year-old boy, was found dead in a derelict house on St. Margaret's Road. His body bore no obvious signs of violence, but foam around his mouth suggested asphyxiation. The post-mortem examination was inconclusive, and Martin's death was initially attributed to an accident or possible poisoning. Unbeknownst to investigators, Mary had killed Martin by strangling him. She later told police she had been alone when she committed the act. This moment marked the beginning of a horrifying chapter in Scotswood's history. The day after Martin's death, Mary and Norma broke into a local nursery and vandalized the property. Amid the destruction, they left behind 4 notes that were both nonsensical and chilling. One read, "I murder so that I may come back." Another stated, "We did murder Martin Brown. F off, you bastard." The notes were dismissed by police as a childish prank, but they were anything but innocent. In the days that followed, Mary displayed a morbid fascination with Martin's death. She and Norma visited his family under the guise of paying their respects, but Mary's behavior was unnerving. When Martin's mother told the girls they couldn't see him because he was dead, Mary replied, "Oh, I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." 2 months later, on July 31st, Mary struck again, This time, her victim was 3-year-old Brian Howe. He was last seen playing outside with his siblings, the family dog, and Mary and Norma. When he failed to return home, a search was launched. His body was found later that evening in a wasteland known locally as Tin Lizzie. Brian's death was even more brutal than Martin's. He had been strangled, and his body bore signs of post-mortem mutilation. Puncture wounds covered his legs, his genitals had been partially mutilated, and someone had attempted to carve the letter M into his stomach. Broken scissors lay nearby. The coroner concluded that the killer had used minimal force, suggesting the perpetrator was another child. Fibers found on Brian's clothing matched items belonging to both Mary and Norma, further implicating them in the crime. As the police investigation intensified, Mary's behavior became increasingly erratic. She made contradictory statements about her involvement, once claiming to have seen another boy attack Brian, and another time recounting details only the killer could have known, such as the broken scissors. Norma, under pressure from investigators, eventually confessed that Mary had been the one to kill Brian. She claimed Mary had strangled him while saying, "My hands are getting thick. Take over." Norma's confession led police to formally arrest both girls on August 7th, the day of Brian's funeral. Mary showed no remorse when charged with Brian's murder, responding, "That's all right by me." But her composure cracked when she was charged with Martin's murder as well. The community of Scotswood was in shock. How could two young girls commit such horrific acts? As the case unfolded, the answers would only deepen the sense of tragedy surrounding Mary Bell's story. The trial of Mary Bell and Norma Bell began on December 5, 1968, at Newcastle Assizes. The case was unprecedented, not just because of the age of the defendants, but because of the sheer horror of their alleged crimes. An entire community reeled from the revelation that two children could be responsible for such violence, and the trial gripped the nation as the details unfolded. For the prosecution, the task was to convince the jury that both girls were equally culpable in the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. But from the outset, it was clear that Mary Bell was the more dominant figure. Norma, while present at the scenes of the crimes, was portrayed as a passive participant, following Mary's lead rather than initiating any violence herself. The lead prosecutor, Rudolph Lyons QC, opened the case with a stark statement. "This is a case of cold-blooded murder, carried out for the pleasure and excitement of the act itself." He painted Mary as a cunning and manipulative individual, driven not by rage or desperation but by a chilling desire to kill. The trial hinged on a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the confessions of both girls. Fibers from Mary and Norma's clothing had been found on both victims, linking them to the crimes. Witnesses recounted seeing the girls with Brian Howe shortly before his death, and Norma's own statements to police implicated Mary as the instigator. Mary's behavior during the trial was unsettling. She alternated between acting indifferent and displaying sudden outbursts of emotion. At times, she appeared calm, almost smug, as though she were enjoying the attention. Other times she cried uncontrollably, clinging to the female police officers assigned to watch over her. Norma, in contrast, was visibly terrified throughout the proceedings. She cried frequently and seemed confused by the legal jargon and the gravity of the situation. Her defense team argued that she was a victim of Mary's influence, a vulnerable child who had been coerced into participating in acts she didn't fully understand. The most chilling moments of the trial came when the prosecution detailed the murders themselves. Martin Brown, the first victim, was found with no obvious signs of violence aside from foam around his mouth. However, the prosecution argued that Mary had strangled him, knowing full well the lethal consequences of her actions. Brian Howe's murder was even more disturbing. The coroner's testimony revealed that the killer had inflicted post-mortem injuries, including mutilating the boy's genitals and attempting to carve the letter M into his stomach. This detail, the prosecution argued, was a signature, a way for Mary to leave her mark on her victim. Norma's testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial. She described how Mary had led Brian to the wasteland known as Tin Lizzie and pushed him to the ground. According to Norma, Mary then began strangling Brian, stopping only briefly to say her hands were getting thick before urging Norma to take over. Norma claimed she refused, running away while Mary continued to attack the boy. Under cross-examination, Norma admitted she had been present when Brian was killed and had failed to intervene or seek help. This admission damaged her credibility and left the jury to grapple with whether she was a frightened bystander or an active accomplice. Mary's testimony was equally shocking. She denied any responsibility for the murders, instead blaming Norma for both deaths. According to Mary, Norma had been the one to strangle Martin Brown and Brian Howe, while she had merely watched. Mary described feeling paralyzed with fear during the killings, claiming she had been unable to stop Norma or alert anyone afterward. This claim was undermined by Mary's own contradictory statements. She had previously confessed to the murders during police interviews, providing details that only the killer could have known, such as the presence of the broken scissors at the crime scene. Her fluctuating accounts and apparent lack of remorse painted a picture of a child capable of manipulation and deceit. Psychological evaluations of both girls played a significant role in the trial. 4 psychiatrists testified about Mary's mental state, concluding that she suffered from a psychopathic personality disorder. They described her as cunning, manipulative, and emotionally detached, a child who lacked empathy and exhibited a dangerous fascination with violence. Norma, on the other hand, was found to be intellectually delayed and easily influenced. Her psychological assessments suggested she was more of a follower than a leader, raising questions about her culpability. As the trial progressed, the jury faced the difficult task of determining whether the girls had acted together or whether one was more responsible than the other. The defense for both girls argued that their age and upbringing had profoundly shaped their actions. Mary's defense team highlighted the severe abuse she had endured at the hands of her mother and her mother's clients. They argued that Mary's actions were the result of a deeply traumatic childhood, which had warped her understanding of right and wrong. Norma's defense focused on her limited mental capacity and her susceptibility to Mary's influence. Her lawyer described her as a pawn in Mary's twisted games, a frightened child who lacked the maturity to resist or understand the consequences of her actions. The closing arguments were powerful and emotionally charged. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the evidence and the calculated nature of the murders. They painted Mary as a dangerous individual who had acted with full knowledge of her actions, while Norma had willingly gone along with her. The defense countered by asking the jury to consider the girls' ages, backgrounds, and mental states. They argued that Mary was a product of her environment, a victim of circumstances beyond her control. They also questioned the reliability of Norma's testimony, suggesting she had exaggerated her account to deflect blame. After 9 days of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Mary Bell was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges. Mary's conviction marked her as Britain's youngest female killer, a label that would follow her for the rest of her life. The judge, Mr. Justice Cusack, described her as a dangerous individual who posed a grave risk to others. He sentenced her to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite sentence that allowed for her release only when deemed safe. Norma's acquittal was met with mixed reactions. Some saw her as a victim of Mary's manipulation, while others believed she had escaped justice. Regardless, the trial left a lasting impact on both girls, as well as the families of their victims. For the families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe, the verdict provided little solace. Their children were gone, and the details of the trial had only deepened their grief. The murders left a scar on the community of Scotswood, where the memories of that summer would never fade. Mary Bell's imprisonment was the beginning of a long and controversial journey. Over the years, she would face repeated scrutiny from the public and the media, even after her release. Her story raises difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the long shadow of childhood trauma. The case of Mary Bell remains one of the most haunting in criminal history, a story of innocence lost, lives shattered, and a society grappling with the darkest corners of human behavior. It's often said that children are the embodiment of innocence, vessels of joy untouched by the world's darkness. But what if that innocence masks something far more sinister? Imagine a child not as a symbol of hope, but as a harbinger of fear. A child whose actions defy everything we believe about the capacity for good and evil. Next, we will uncover the chilling story of Amarjit Sada, the youngest serial killer in recorded history. His crimes left an entire village in shock, a nation questioning itself, and the world grappling with a case unlike any other. The story begins in a small, tightly knit village in Bihar, India. Life here wasn't easy. The sun bore down relentlessly, and the people toiled under its weight, eking out a meager existence. The families in this village had little, but they clung to one thing that gave them hope and happiness: their children. The laughter of children playing in the dusty streets was a reminder of life's small joys. It was their beacon amid hardship. Among these families was the Sada family. They were no different from their neighbors, struggling to make ends meet while cherishing their close-knit community. Generations of relatives lived side by side, bound by ties of blood and tradition. For the Sadas, family was everything, a fortress of support in a harsh world. But even in the safest of places, cracks can form, and darkness can seep in. In 2006, a storm began brewing in the Sada household. It started subtly, with the unexplained disappearance of a 6-year-old girl, one of Amarjit Sada's cousins. One sunny afternoon, the girl left to play with her cousins just as she had countless times before. But when the other children returned home, she did not. At first, no alarm bells rang. Villagers assumed she had wandered off, or perhaps stayed at a relative's home. After all, in a community as interconnected as theirs, children were often seen as everyone's responsibility. Days turned into weeks and the whispers grew louder. But no one wanted to intrude on the family's grief, assuming they were mourning in silence. Yet something was unsettling about the Sada's reaction. There was no visible despair, no frantic search parties. Instead, the family seemed eerily silent. People wondered, why weren't they speaking up? What could explain their lack of urgency? Before these questions could be answered, another tragedy struck. The Sadas welcomed a baby girl into the world, a beacon of hope after the disappearance of their niece. But this ray of hope was short-lived. Just months after her birth, the baby vanished without a trace. This time, the grief was harder to hide. A mother's heartache is not easily concealed, and while the family's silence persisted, the villagers could sense something was deeply wrong. The disappearances weren't isolated incidents, they were a pattern. The Sadas, however, kept their pain locked behind closed doors, and the village chose not to pry. In this close-knit community, boundaries were respected, even when they came at the cost of answers. But the unsettling questions lingered. How could 2 children vanish without a trace? Was this merely a cruel twist of fate, or was something far darker at play? The answers would come soon enough, and they would shake the village to its core. In 2007, tragedy struck again, but this time it wasn't confined to the Sada family. 6-month-old Khushbu, a baby from another family in the village, disappeared. Her mother had left her at the local primary school, believing it was the safest place for her child while she worked. The school was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where children were protected and nurtured. But when Khushbu's mother returned to collect her, the child was gone. The panic was immediate. Unlike the muted reaction of the Sadas, Khushbu's mother was relentless. She raced through the village, her voice trembling with desperation as she called out her daughter's name. She knocked on every door, stopping anyone who crossed her path, pleading for information. Yet no one had answers. The staff at the school were equally baffled. They swore they hadn't seen anyone take the child, and yet she had vanished, leaving nothing but an aching silence in her wake. It was during this frantic search that Khushbu's mother approached a member of the Sada family, hoping for a glimmer of information. She explained her plight through sobs, her desperation palpable. And then, something strange happened. The Sada family member didn't seem surprised. Instead, they offered to accompany her to the police station. This gesture seemed promising, but it carried an undertone of unease. Why would the Sadas know anything about Khushbu's disappearance? The mother didn't have time to question it. She needed help, and this was the closest thing to a lead. When the police arrived, they didn't waste any time. They began by questioning the villagers, hoping to piece together a timeline of events. It was then that the Sadas pointed the police toward a boy, a child no one would have suspected. Amarjit Sada was 8 years old. With his slight frame and innocent demeanor, he looked like any other boy from the village. When the officers approached him, he didn't seem nervous or afraid. If anything, he was curious. "Do you know where Khushbu is?" one of the officers asked gently. To their astonishment, Amarjit nodded. "Yes," he replied calmly. The officers waited, expecting him to reveal that he had seen her wandering off, or perhaps knew of someone who had taken her. But what came next stunned everyone into silence. "She's dead," Amarjit said matter-of-factly. "I killed her." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. The villagers who had gathered around gasped audibly, their faces etched with disbelief. At first, the police thought Amarjit was lying. Surely an 8-year-old couldn't be capable of such a horrific act. But Amarjit was insistent. He even offered to show them where he had hidden Khushbu's body. Reluctantly, the officers followed him. Amarjit led them to a secluded spot, and there, in a shallow grave, lay the lifeless body of baby Khushbu. The horror didn't end there. Amarjit recounted with chilling detail how he had taken Khushbu from the school. He described how he had strangled her, his small hands pressing down with surprising force. When she cried and struggled, he grew frustrated. He grabbed a stone and began striking her, over and over, until her cries stopped. His words were delivered with an eerie calmness, a detachment that left even the most seasoned officers unsettled. Amarjit was taken into custody, but the shockwaves of his confession rippled through the village. How could a child commit such atrocities? What had driven him to kill, not once, but multiple times? For the villagers, the pieces began to fall into place. The disappearances of the 2 Sada girls were no longer mysteries. Amarjit himself confirmed what many had begun to suspect. He had killed his 6-year-old cousin and his baby sister in the same brutal manner. The Sada family's silence now made sense, though it was no less disturbing. They had known all along. Amarjit had confessed to them, just as he had confessed to the police. But instead of seeking help, they had chosen to protect him, believing that he was too young to understand the consequences of his actions. What could turn a child into a killer? What darkness had taken root in Amarjit Sada, and why had no one seen the warning signs? As we unravel the layers of this case, the answers may be more troubling than we expect. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the mind of the world's youngest serial killer. The next chapter will explore Amarjit's psychological evaluation, his time in custody, and the broader societal implications of his case. Amarjit Sada's case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national spectacle. The revelation that an 8-year-old boy had committed not 1, but 3 murders sent shockwaves through India and beyond. The question on everyone's mind was the same. How could this happen? For those in the village, the events felt like an unending nightmare. What was once a close-knit, supportive community was now fractured by fear and suspicion. Parents, who had previously trusted their children to play freely in the streets, now kept them close, their eyes scanning for any sign of danger. But the threat wasn't an unknown predator or an outsider. It had come from within. At the police station, Amarjit sat quietly, swinging his legs beneath the chair, oblivious to the storm swirling around him. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. To Inspector Chaturag Kumar, it was the most unsettling sight he had ever witnessed. This was no hardened criminal, no calculating killer. He was just a boy, small for his age, with a cherubic face that betrayed no sign of malice. But his words told a different story. "Why did you do it?" Kumar asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Amarjit tilted his head as if the question puzzled him. "Because I wanted to," he replied simply, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. The inspector pressed further, asking if Amarjit understood that he had ended 3 lives. Amarjit shrugged. "They made noise, so I stopped them." It was clear that Amarjit didn't grasp the gravity of his actions. For him, death was not an irreversible finality, but merely a solution to an inconvenience. As investigators delved deeper into Amarjit's past, a chilling picture began to emerge. Born in 1998 in the rural district of Begusarai, Bihar, Amarjit was the eldest of 4 siblings. His family lived in abject poverty, with his father working as a laborer for meager wages. Like many families in their village, they struggled to put food on the table, and the arrival of each new child only added to their financial strain. Despite these challenges, there was little in Amarjit's early years to suggest the darkness that would later consume him. Neighbors described him as quiet, a boy who rarely caused trouble. He played with other children and seemed to enjoy their company. But those closest to him began noticing troubling signs as he grew older. Amarjit had an unsettling fascination with inflicting pain. His first victims were animals, small birds and stray dogs that he would lure away before hurting them. When confronted, he would laugh, dismissing his actions as mere games. His parents, uneducated and overwhelmed by their own struggles, didn't recognize these behaviors as red flags. Instead, they chastised him lightly or ignored his actions altogether, hoping he would grow out of it. But Amarjit didn't grow out of it. He grew bolder. The murder of his cousin in 2006 was his first known act of violence against a human. The details of the crime were horrifying. Amarjit had lured the 6-year-old girl to a secluded area under the guise of playing a game. There, he strangled her, relishing her fear and helplessness. When she fell unconscious, he bludgeoned her with a stone until she died. When Amarjit confessed to his family, they were horrified, but their reaction was one of denial and secrecy. Instead of seeking help or reporting the crime, they convinced themselves it was an isolated incident. After all, Amarjit was only 7 years old. Surely he didn't fully understand what he had done. But the murder of his baby sister just months later shattered any illusions that Amarjit's behavior was a one-time aberration. Again, he confessed, and again, his family chose silence. This time, they swore to watch him more closely, to prevent him from acting on his violent impulses. By the time Amarjit killed Khushbu in 2007, his pattern of behavior was undeniable. He was not a child acting out of ignorance or accident. He was a predator. Amarjit's arrest raised a host of complex legal and ethical questions. Under Indian law, children under the age of 12 cannot be held criminally responsible for their actions. This meant that despite the severity of his crimes, Amarjit could not be tried as an adult or sentenced to prison. Instead, he was sent to a juvenile home for observation and rehabilitation. But even within the confines of this institution, Amarjit's behavior was deeply troubling. He displayed no remorse for his actions, often recounting his crimes with a disturbing sense of pride. Psychologists and criminologists were brought in to evaluate him, and their findings were as chilling as the crimes themselves. Amarjit was diagnosed with conduct disorder, a behavioral condition characterized by a lack of empathy, a disregard for rules, and a propensity for aggression. In severe cases, conduct disorder can escalate into antisocial personality disorder, commonly associated with sociopathy or psychopathy. But Amarjit's age complicated matters. Could a child so young truly be classified as a sociopath? Or were his actions a product of his environment, years of poverty, neglect, and possible abuse? Dr. Ramesh Gupta, a forensic psychologist who studied Amarjit's case, noted that while his diagnosis was clear, its origins were murky. Children like Amarjit don't just emerge out of nowhere, Gupta explained. There are always contributing factors, whether genetic, environmental, or both. The question is not just what he did, but why he did it. The why of Amarjit's actions became a subject of intense debate. Some argued that his violent tendencies were a result of his upbringing. Growing up in poverty, surrounded by hardship, may have desensitized him to suffering. Others speculated that he might have witnessed or experienced abuse within his family, fueling his need to exert power over others. There was also the question of cultural attitudes toward children in rural India. Boys were often viewed as assets, heirs who would carry on the family name, while girls were seen as burdens. This mindset may have influenced the Sada family's decision to shield Amarjit. Protecting their son, no matter his crimes, may have felt like a necessity in a society where male children were often prioritized. But not everyone was willing to excuse Amarjit's behavior as a product of circumstance. For many, the sheer brutality of his crimes suggested an innate darkness, something beyond the influence of his environment. In the juvenile home, Amarjit's days were structured and closely monitored. He attended counseling sessions and therapy, though his progress was slow. Staff described him as cooperative but detached, as if he were merely going through the motions. When Amarjit turned 18 in 2016, he was released from the juvenile system. By law, his criminal record was sealed, and he was given a new identity to protect him from public backlash. Where he went after his release remains a mystery. Some believe he returned to a village under a different name, blending into the anonymity of rural life. Others speculate he may have moved to a city, where he could disappear into the crowd. Amarjit's case continues to haunt those who knew him and those who studied it. It raises uncomfortable questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the nature of evil. Can a child who commits such heinous acts ever truly be reformed? Or do they carry the seeds of violence with them into adulthood? For the families of his victims, the wounds remain raw. Khushbu's mother, in particular, has struggled to find peace. "Every day, I think about my daughter," she said in an interview years later. "I trusted that she was safe, and now she's gone, and the boy who took her from me is free." Amarjit's story is a grim reminder of the importance of early intervention. Behavioral disorders in children often go unnoticed or untreated, particularly in impoverished communities with limited access to mental health resources. But even with intervention, some questions may never be answered. What drives a child to kill? Can they ever fully comprehend the impact of their actions? And perhaps most chillingly, could it happen again? Today, Amarjit Sada remains an enigma. Somewhere in the world he walks among us, carrying the weight of his past, or perhaps feeling nothing at all. His case forces us to confront our deepest fears about human nature, to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes monsters don't hide in the shadows. They live among us, and sometimes they look like children. Warwick, Rhode Island, a suburban town where the hum of lawnmowers and the laughter of children were more common than the wail of sirens. On any given day, it was a peaceful place where families knew their neighbors, doors were left unlocked, and the thought of danger seemed far away. But in the summer of 1987, that sense of safety was shattered in the most gruesome way imaginable. Rebecca Spencer was 27 years old. A mother of two, she was described as kind, hardworking, and hopeful about her future. She lived on Eanes Street in a modest house, one she was preparing to leave. Boxes were stacked and plans were set. She was moving to another part of town, eager for a fresh start. On July 27, 1987, Rebecca's plans came to a violent and abrupt end. When her body was discovered, the scene was horrifying. Rebecca had been stabbed 58 times. The brutality was shocking even to seasoned investigators. Warwick police quickly launched an investigation, but there were no immediate suspects, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The neighborhood, once serene, was now gripped by fear. Residents wondered if the killer was still among them, someone they might know. Police canvassed the area, interviewed neighbors, and scrutinized anyone who might have had a motive. Across the street from Rebecca's house was the home of the Price family, where 13-year-old Craig Price lived with his parents and older brother. Craig was a large kid for his age, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds. He had a reputation in the neighborhood, not for violence, but for being a troublemaker. Petty theft, breaking and entering, and arguments with his parents often brought the police to the Price home. But nothing in Craig's record hinted at the monstrous violence that had unfolded across the street. For 2 years, Rebecca's murder remained unsolved. The investigation stalled. With no concrete evidence and no new leads, her case grew cold. But the memory of her death lingered in the minds of her family, friends, and neighbors. Then, in the fall of 1989, Warwick's peaceful facade was shattered once again. It was Labor Day weekend, and most families in Warwick were enjoying barbecues and time together. Joan Heaton, a 39-year-old mother, was spending the holiday at home with her two daughters, Jennifer, age 10, and Melissa, age 8. Joan was a devoted mother, raising her girls with love and care after the loss of her husband in 1983. Her daughters were inseparable, full of life and laughter. When Joan failed to return her mother's calls over the holiday weekend, alarm bells started ringing. It was unusual for Joan to go more than a day without checking in. By Monday, her mother, Mary Boussier, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Mary decided to visit Joan's home at 95 Metropolitan Drive, bringing along her other daughter, Mary Lou. As they approached the house, a sense of unease settled over them. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of activity inside. Mary and Mary Lou entered the house, immediately hit by a foul, nauseating smell. At first, they thought it might be rotting food, but as they stepped further inside, the source of the odor became horrifyingly clear. In the living room, they found Joan lying on the floor, partially covered by a sheet, her body soaked in blood. The walls, the floor, everything around her was stained. In the hallway nearby lay Jennifer, her young body similarly brutalized. And in the kitchen, they found Melissa, her small frame sprawled on the floor amidst a pool of blood. Mary and Mary Lou stood frozen in shock, trying to process the unimaginable. Their screams echoed through the house as they dialed 911, desperate for help that had come far too late. When police arrived, the scale of the violence was almost too much to comprehend. The scene was eerily similar to Rebecca Spencer's murder 2 years earlier. Joan had been stabbed 57 times. Jennifer, 62 times. Melissa had been stabbed 30 times with such force that the knife blade was left embedded in her neck. Her skull had been crushed, likely with a kitchen stool. The murder weapon, as with Rebecca's case, was a knife taken from the victim's own kitchen. Investigators couldn't ignore the similarities. Both crimes were characterized by frenzied overkill. Both murders involved victims attacked in their own homes with no evidence of forced entry. The Warwick Police Department was overwhelmed. Detectives worked around the clock, piecing together evidence and fielding calls from a terrified community. Rumors swirled. People wondered if there was a serial killer in their midst. Parents watched their children more closely. Residents bought extra locks for their doors, and some even began sleeping with weapons nearby. Detectives Pendergast and Anderson, seasoned investigators with years of experience, were assigned to the case. They knew they were dealing with a killer whose rage was unlike anything they'd seen before. One clue stood out at the Heaton crime scene: a bloody footprint. The size was unmistakable, a men's size 13. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. In the days following the Heaton murders, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood, hoping to uncover any information that could point them toward a suspect. Their attention soon turned to Craig Price, the now 15-year-old boy who lived just a few houses away. Craig wasn't an obvious suspect. He had no history of violent crime. But detectives couldn't ignore his size. He wore a size 13 shoe, matching the footprint found at the scene. And when they approached him for questioning, they noticed something else: a fresh bandage on his hand. When asked about the injury, Craig claimed he had cut himself while punching a car window on Keeley Avenue. Detectives checked the area but found no broken glass or reports of vandalism. Craig's story didn't add up. Despite their suspicions, the police had no hard evidence linking Craig to the murders. They decided to keep a close eye on him, noting his behavior and movements. A few weeks later, detectives convinced Craig to come down to the station for a polygraph test. He arrived with his parents, appearing calm and cooperative. But the results of the test raised red flags. Craig's responses indicated deception. With growing suspicion, detectives sought a warrant to search the Price home. They didn't have much: a failed polygraph test, an injury with a flimsy explanation, and a matching shoe size. But it was enough to convince a judge. In the early hours of a September morning, police descended on the Price family home. Officers banged on the door, waking the household. Craig's father, John Price, groggily opened the door to find police standing on the porch, warrant in hand. The Price family was gathered in the living room as officers began their search. Craig, still half asleep, appeared unfazed. At one point, he even dozed off on the couch. Out in the backyard, officers made a chilling discovery. Inside a shed, they found a bag filled with bloody clothing, gloves, and a knife. The items were immediately taken into evidence. When officers returned to the living room, they placed Craig under arrest. His parents, stunned and in disbelief, followed as he was taken to the station for questioning. At the station, detectives sat across from Craig expecting a wall of silence. Instead, what they got was a full confession. Craig admitted to breaking into the Heaton home. His initial intention, he claimed, was burglary. But when Joan woke up and confronted him, he panicked. What followed was a frenzied attack, one that spiraled into the brutal killings of her daughters as well. In chilling detail, Craig recounted the murders, describing how he had stabbed each victim repeatedly. He spoke without remorse, as though recounting an ordinary event. Then, almost casually, he admitted to Rebecca Spencer's murder 2 years earlier. He explained that he had broken into her house intending to steal, but killed her when she woke up and saw him. Detectives were stunned. Craig Price, a 15-year-old boy, had committed 4 murders, each more horrific than the last. As news of Craig's arrest spread, the community was left reeling. People struggled to reconcile the image of the boy they knew with the monster described in the police reports. For the families of Rebecca Spencer and the Heaton girls, the confession brought a sense of closure but also a deep, unrelenting grief. 4 lives had been stolen, and now the question loomed: what would happen to Craig Price? The town of Warwick, Rhode Island had its answers, but they brought no solace. The community now knew who had brutally taken the lives of Rebecca Spencer, Joan Heaton, and her 2 young daughters, Jennifer and Melissa. Yet there was no comfort in knowing the name behind the horrors: Craig Price. A 15-year-old boy had committed 4 of the most brutal murders the town had ever witnessed. His calm, methodical confession stunned even the most seasoned investigators. But if the story of Craig Price's crimes was horrific, the legal fallout was nothing short of infuriating for the victims' families and the community. Craig's arrest made headlines across the nation. The details of the crimes were chilling. A teenager with no prior violent record, attacking with such ferocity that the word overkill felt insufficient. But one detail overshadowed everything else: Craig Price's age. In 1989, Rhode Island law stated that juveniles could not be tried as adults, no matter the severity of their crimes. The maximum penalty Craig could face was confinement to a juvenile detention facility until his 21st birthday. 6 years, 4 lives. For the families of the victims, the realization was unbearable. Joan Heaton's mother, Mary Boussier, became a fierce advocate for change. The thought of Craig Price walking free at 21, without any criminal record to follow him, was unthinkable. Craig was sent to the Rhode Island Training School, a juvenile detention center in Cranston. It was meant to be a place of rehabilitation, but Craig's demeanor quickly revealed that he had no intention of reforming. Inside the facility, Craig seemed to thrive in a twisted way. His size and aggression made him intimidating to staff and other inmates. He boasted about his crimes, showing no remorse. He even threatened to kill again once he was released, telling staff and fellow detainees that he intended to become famous for his actions. The Heaton and Spencer families watched helplessly as Craig's behavior behind bars made headlines. There were stories of him being granted special privileges, even filming a rap video that included threatening and violent lyrics. To the families, it felt like Craig Price was being coddled rather than punished. The outrage in Rhode Island was palpable. How could someone who had committed such heinous acts face so little accountability? Mary Boussier became a prominent voice in the fight to change the laws. She worked tirelessly to advocate for reforms that would allow juveniles to be tried as adults in extreme cases. In 1990, just a year after Craig's arrest, Rhode Island passed new legislation permitting juveniles to be tried as adults for severe crimes, including murder. But for Craig Price's case, the change came too late. The new law could not be applied retroactively, and Craig remained untouchable under the old rules. The frustration in the community was immense. While the law had changed to prevent future tragedies, it felt like justice for Craig's victims would never be fully served. As Craig's 21st birthday approached in 1994, his release loomed large. But Craig Price had not been a model inmate. His violent tendencies had only grown more pronounced during his time in detention. He got into frequent altercations with staff and other inmates. He refused to undergo psychological evaluations, a defiant act that would later prove pivotal. In a stroke of legal ingenuity, prosecutors found a way to extend Craig's confinement. They began charging him with crimes committed while in custody, assaulting guards, threatening staff, and refusing to participate in mandatory rehabilitation programs. One incident in particular stood out. Craig had attacked a detention center staff member with such force that he was charged with assault and sentenced to additional time. These charges, though unrelated to his original crimes, allowed the legal system to keep Craig Price behind bars. By 1994, Craig's behavior had made it clear that he was far too dangerous to release. He was transferred from the juvenile facility to an adult prison, where his violent tendencies continued to surface. Craig's time in prison was marked by a pattern of escalating aggression. He frequently fought with other inmates and threatened prison staff. His threats were not empty. He spoke openly about his desire to kill again. In 1998, Craig was charged with contempt for refusing to comply with a court-ordered psychological evaluation. This charge added another 15 years to his sentence, a small victory for those fighting to keep him incarcerated. Despite these legal maneuvers, Craig Price remained a constant source of fear for the families of his victims. His letters and statements to the media were laced with hostility, and his lack of remorse was evident. In 2004, Craig was transferred from Rhode Island to a maximum security prison in Florida. The move was prompted by his repeated violent outbursts and the need for a facility better equipped to handle his behavior. But even in Florida, Craig's violence continued. In 2009, he attacked another inmate with a shank, stabbing him multiple times. The attack nearly killed the victim and added 25 more years to Craig's sentence. This incident was a grim reminder of Craig Price's capacity for violence. To those who had fought to keep him behind bars, it was validation of their fears. Craig Price was a man who would never be safe to release. While Craig remained in prison, the legacy of his crimes left an indelible mark on Warwick. The Heaton and Spencer families continued to mourn the loss of their loved ones, their grief compounded by the knowledge that justice had never truly been served. For Mary Boussier, her fight for legal reform became a way to honor her daughter and granddaughters. She worked tirelessly to ensure that no other family would have to endure the pain of seeing a killer walk free due to outdated laws. The changes she and others fought for have had a lasting impact on Rhode Island's juvenile justice system. Today, the state's laws allow for juveniles to be tried as adults in cases of extreme violence. Craig Price remains incarcerated, now in his mid-40s. The boy who once terrorized a community has grown into a man, but his capacity for violence remains unchanged. To this day, he shows no remorse for his actions. His chilling confessions, delivered with an unnerving calm, continue to haunt those who have heard them. The story of Craig Price is not just one of tragedy and loss, it is a story of resilience and reform. The families of his victims turned their pain into a catalyst for change, ensuring that the laws of their state would better protect future generations. But the scars left by Craig Price's crimes will never fully heal. 4 lives were taken in acts of unimaginable brutality, and the memories of Rebecca Spencer, Joan Heaton, Jennifer, and Melissa remain etched in the hearts of those who loved them. As the years pass, the name Craig Price serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most unassuming facade. It is a name that will forever be synonymous with one of Rhode Island's most chilling chapters, a story that no one who lived through it will ever forget.